Hey everyone, tonight we start with a very relatable sleep, or more precisely, how people slept in the Middle Ages, which is stranger than most of us could have imagined. So before you go, if you truly like what I do, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you in the comments section below. It's amazing to see who is coming from all around the world. Now turn off the lights, perhaps turn on a fan to provide a gentle background hum as we begin our journey together tonight. Electricity. Influences of TikTok and sleep hygiene. People in the Middle Ages had a timetable for the evening that would bewilder the contemporary melatonin fanatic. It was referred to as fragmented sleep, and natural, like a stale medieval biscuit. The two-part sleep cycle splits neatly in half. The routine was straightforward. Most individuals went to bed early after sunset and fell asleep, what was referred to as first sleep, and they would awaken approximately 4 hours later, purposefully, and devote the following hour or two to what can only be described as medieval multitasking at midnight. This was simply the way sleep operated and wasn't seen as insomnia. People viewed the watch period between the two sleeps as useful and sometimes frighteningly social. Because nothing destroys a ram, they utilized this time to pray, read religious scriptures, tend fires, or inspect their livestock. Cycle, such as seeing whether your goat remains in the yard. And sure, this was medieval doctors and marriage guides believed that this was the best time for intimacy, observed that the body was relaxed and well rested at this time, which it seems like a courteous way of indicating that you're too exhausted to argue. So if you ever felt that getting up early to prepare coffee for your significant other is romantic, remember that your forefathers were setting the standard extremely high. In contrast, this lull would be followed by a second sleep that would remain until dawn. Everyone took part in this nightly rhythm, including farmers and monks, and even literary luminaries like Chaucer participated informally. Mentioned it, indicating that certainly individuals were writing about inadequate sleep even in medieval literature. Surprisingly, contemporary research has indicated that humans may potentially benefit more from segmented sleep. In the absence of artificial light, our circadian rhythms are in harmony with the two sleep cycles. So the next time when you're wide awake at 2 in the morning, don't freak out. Simply mutter, sure, that the watch has started. Additionally, attend to a symbolic hearth. This wasn't done until the industrial period of factories, gaslighting, and the increasing concern about human inefficiency, which led to the imposition of 8 hours of sleep in a row, as if waking up in the Middle Ages were a timed sport. It was not a failure in the middle of the night. Whether they liked it or not, everyone followed the schedule. Let's discuss beds, or more specifically, how they are approximated in the medieval world today. We are obsessed with memory foam cooling gels, thread counts, and whether a mattress is. In medieval Europe, a bed was frequently nothing more than a heap of once-living materials that had been compressed under the weight. With restless nights and silent laments, the average peasant bed was made up of pallets, also called straw mattresses, were actually straw or hay packed into a rough fabric sack if they were fortunate enough to have a sack. Otherwise, it was simply straw on the ground that can be wet or that has already been grabbed by a... Although these pallets were uncomfortable, they were still preferable to nothing, and the straw was inexpensive. It was abundant, excellent at keeping out the cold, and capable of storing if it itched. Mosquitoes, lice, and the occasional field mouse made it difficult to sleep or exercise. I ignored it, moved slightly, and prayed for the best if it bit. The family could raise the straw mattress onto a wooden frame if they had a little more money, or at least a working back. Didn't significantly alter the quality of sleep, although it did lessen the likelihood of waking up with insects in your ear. A little. Most individuals slept in their clothes because linens were a rare treat. They didn't particularly care about personal space or pajamas, which they wore all day. Entire family, including parents, kids, and possibly grandparents, all slept together in the same area, occasionally on the same stack of straw. And if you became too hot, you nobles, of course, had good beds, and you should always roll into your cousin's elbow. Canopies, embroidered linens, feather mattresses, and big wooden frames to keep out drafts and, ideally, lice. You didn't inherit these beds because they were so precious that they were bequeathed to you in wills. The oddly lumpy feather bed that you received from Aunt Matilda is still for the majority of medieval people, a bed was a place to avoid freezing rather than a haven of comfort, to stay away from the chickens, and perhaps even to hope for financial success, so that, when we heard the nightcap today, we slept on something that didn't ruffle or squawk. Consider a warm little beverage, something with whiskey, a cozy fire, and a dubious choice. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap was headgear rather than a drink. Actual, physical, frequently absurd-looking cloth used to prevent your skull from freezing off while you sleep. As you can see, medieval construction wasn't particularly good at providing insulation. Drafty thatched roofs, stone walls, and windows, composed of oiled parchment or thin animal horn, did nothing to combat the central heating and cold that was referred to as a dog in order to keep their heads warm at night, particularly because body heat medieval folk embraced the simple nightcap, which came in a variety of shapes and sizes as the fastest way to escape through the scalp. Sizes. But the most famous one was long and pointed, as one might anticipate from a magician who doubles as a traditionally, chimney sweeps were constructed from wool, linen, or whatever left over. For men, it was a way to avoid upsetting the family. Goat without sacrificing warmth. Useful piece of clothing for women. It occasionally functioned as a head wrap or coif, serving the jewel in order to preserve modesty and hide hair that hasn't been washed since last Lent, yet is still heated at night. In many areas, married women were expected to wear caps since they had social weight. Always keep their heads covered, even when they're sleeping. And the cap itself may adorned or coloured to symbolize a family's wealth or prestige, because nothing conveys success more than sleeping. In more metropolitan contexts, wearing a nightcap with a miniature flag on your skull even began to represent being off duty. If you opened, wearing one to your door was a courteous medieval expression that meant, "I'm not dressed for conversation." Indeed, this hat does naturally. Nightcaps were frequently worn with nightshirts, which were basically a portrait of Ebenezer Scrooge without the haunted moral in long, loose tunics. Although the educational sleepwear wasn't particularly attractive, it was useful, scratchy, and sometimes nowadays, sleeping close to a stranger is usually restricted to red-eye flights because it is combustible and too ambitious, camping vacations, or the odd Airbnb mishap. But in medieval Europe, this was not at all optional and was entirely typical. Suppose you are a travelling salesperson. You locate an inn if you're a pilgrim, or simply someone whose mule died on the route to Norwich. Uncommon luxury in and of itself. And when you request a place to sleep, you don't receive a room or a bed, or even an exceptionally spotless floor. You receive a place in a bed that's medieval inns that were already occupied. Functioned more like human bunk homes than contemporary hotels. If the bed had an area that you were typically sharing, privacy was not expected. Total strangers who might talk in their sleep or snore, or have an unusually high number of boils, were not regarded as impolite. Beds could accommodate 2, 3, or even 4 guests if resources were used efficiently. Depending on social tolerance and city size, you may find yourself in a rows of beds in a dorm-like hall with no personal space at all. Snoring competitions were accepted. Elbow territory was hotly disputed, and occasionally men and women were kept apart, although not always. Some inns attempted to assign beds to blacksmiths with professional clergy thieves, alongside blacksmiths and other thieves, purportedly but frequently. Although this might have seemed like a nightmare to contemporary germaphobes, it was first come, first sprawled. An improvement over sleeping outside among wolves, rain, and the occasional peasant. Many travellers slept with their purses tied to them out of fear of theft, their belt or concealed behind their clothing. Others turned their suitcases into pillows and mattresses by sleeping on top of their bundles. Alarm mechanism. If your bag was shifted, it usually signaled that you were going to wake up. Naturally, the wealthy did not have to endure this fate. Nobility travelled with entourages, who either requested their own rooms if an innkeeper appreciated their comfort or tented in relative comfort. Roof in the Middle Ages. Going to bed was a spiritual experience rather than merely putting a blanket over oneself and falling asleep. Your immortal souls were at stake in this nightly gambling operation. Didn't just sleep, they were ready to die, which is why bedtime prayers are so common. Forget lavender spray or soothing podcasts. Confessions, psalms, and souls were used to wind down medieval sleepers. Provisions pertaining to spiritual purification in case they passed away between good night and dawn. The concept was straightforward. You could pass away from disease or fire at any time. Demons, or more hazardous, being older than 30 years old. You should say your prayers for 1247, not because it was consoling, but because you didn't want to show up unannounced and unclean, and spiritually because hell was a terrible place. A messy one, typical rendition, and I ask the Lord if I should pass away before I awaken. Despite the fact that it's essentially a legal document authored by many adults, had a long list of reasons why a 7-year-old might acknowledge death as a probable bedtime outcome. Prayers for various dangers. One for when you felt bad about yourself, and another for when you believed that the devil may be concealing one in the rafters to prevent plague, which regrettably aged sadly. Some people even prayed to certain saints, who were supposed to protect sleepers, like divine bouncers protecting the extremely pious monks, nuns, and too nervous nobility at the club door. Compline was the last prayer service of the day before they went to bed, and following Compline, they made a vow of silence. This wasn't difficult because everyone was already worn out, malnourished, and somewhat children who were terrified of the dark were also urged to pray, partly because it was beneficial for their souls, and partly because it provided them with something to do instead of questioning why the dog was back in their bed. Parents told them that angels were observing, which is sweet until you realize that there weren't as many guardian angels, and the brief prayer before bed was less about the more celestial surveillance system, peace, and more about damage control. At the last minute, consider it to be medieval, antiviral software, even though you weren't entirely sure how it worked. Dreams are typically written off as random nonsense stress in today's reality. A lot of cheese or your brain attempting to file documents in the dark, but dreams were considered quite important in the medieval era, as gravely as in everlasting. Repercussions. Serious dreams were more than just fantasies, were regarded as messages from God, saints, the devil, your angel of protection, or some dreams were diabolical, while others were divine revelations, possibly the strange artifact you kissed last Sunday. Temptations in any case, you were expected to take notice and perhaps record it, confess it, or observe a 3-day fast. Theologians, monks, and self-described visionaries spent an attempt to be safe. A startling amount of time was spent decoding dreams. Whole volumes were devoted to this task. Fire in a dream could be water in a dream of hell, could represent purification, or a guy drowning. People in the Middle Ages thought that if you saw a goat's head juggling fish, you should summon a priest right away and perhaps relocate. Your dreams were significant since your soul was still functioning while you slept, which meant that your deeds potentially disclose spiritual flaws or hidden sins in a dream that is quite embarrassing. Stealing a loaf of bread could be your subconscious apologizing for your gluttony in the real world, or it could just hunger, but in any event, it's preferable to come clean simply in case monks and nuns frequently. Some were praised for experiencing heavenly visions after recording their dreams and sharing them with spiritual leaders. Others were subtly reminded to eat fewer onions before bed, of course, as they slept. Dreams make great plots in addition to being spiritual riddles. Medieval literature is filled with dream sequences in which knights come into contact with angels, demons, or other symbolic beings. Poetry about virtue dreams was essentially the medieval equivalent of Netflix, but with more symbolism and less joyful conclusions. The church was suspicious, as was to be expected. Every dream was heavenly, but others were thought to be demon-planted, to corrupt the defenseless, something unwholesome. It can indicate that your soul was being attacked, or that you simply slept too near the fireplace smoke once more. In the present era, some people. Allowing their pets to lie in the bed is a comfortable, but often odorous, arrangement. However, in the Middle Ages, sleeping with an animal wasn't a peculiar personal preference. Rather, it was a heating approach. Let's begin with the fundamentals. The dwellings of the Middle Ages weren't designed for. They most likely acquired names because the original stone walls were so harsh and lacked insulation. In peasant dwellings, central heating, known as the family pig, was commonplace. 4. People and animals to sleep in the same space, sometimes sharing a bed and frequently sharing a straw pile. Chickens roamed around freely. Curled up at your feet are dogs. Pigs snorted quietly next to during the night. If you were fortunate, none of them bit you. It was about survival of animals rather than love, although medieval people did value their pets. Produced body heat and, in contrast to certain cousins, were consistently warm. A big dog could prevent your toes from freezing a cow in the blanket, so don't hog it. The corner may increase the temperature by 1 or 2 degrees, which felt like a lot in January. Miraculous medieval households, particularly those belonging to the lowest classes, frequently had only one space for everything. Cooking, eating, resting, and occasionally passing away, children may be cuddled in the same spot that both humans and animals occupied. A chicken could act as a makeshift alarm clock between parents and a goat. Let's avoid asking too many inquiries about cleanliness for households with more money. Nobility didn't typically sleep next to livestock, even though they may still keep their lapdogs in bed for fleas and fashion rather than for warmth. Redistribution. At some castles, favourite animals even got their own sleeping quarters. Since nothing conveys power like, there were limitations to having a dog with its own space and name, of course. They are not, historically speaking, and they can wander and be noisy, recognised for honouring private space. But medieval folk adopted a hoof for, if you've ever had to share a face with someone at 3 a.m, it's just a part of the nighttime routine. Thought, this is a bit much. Let's introduce the medieval monastic dormitory, a place, when in a youth hostel room, where solace went to pass away peacefully while taking a vow of silence. Monasteries didn't think that personal. Space, comfort, or enjoyment compared to the standard dormitory, numerous monks typically sleep in orderly rows in a single spacious chamber, resembling, if you can call them that, morally upright sardine beds, which were occasionally made of wooden boards. If the abbot was feeling very giving or it was a feast day, you slept completely clothed, not naked, on a straw mattress. Modesty, but because it hurt more to get dressed in the dark for prayers at 2 a.m. than it did to simply go to bed. The monastic costume, complete with robe, belt and doubled sandals, is already ready, as inadequate insulation and spiritual armor. If it got chilly, you layered up. If it got hot, no, you didn't. There were no cushions, no privacy drapes, and no talking at all was permitted. This was not advised under. According to St. Benedict's rule, you could be placed on chamber pot duty for a while, if you roll over and groan too loudly. Although weak snoring was an uncontrollable grey area, if you are unruly, the Lord may still hold you or at least your fellow inmates accountable. If there was only one candle and little lighting, perhaps you didn't need to see you. Despite the austerity monks, the objective was to lie still and refrain from sin, felt that their Spartan beds were preparing them for the soul's journey in the hereafter. By rejecting the therefore, any extra sleep was a regulated requirement rather than a joy, and planned exactly like everyone else. Some monks even slept upright too. Compared to this peasant, stay away from any suggestion of affluence, dreams, or circulation. Pigs who snore and piles of straw nearly seem opulent. But at least the pig didn't pass judgment. Let's discuss something that would terrify the majority of contemporary sleepers. Willingly getting up at 2 a.m. and not either a doomsday, scroll or a restroom break, but for prayer, a loud frigid candle was lit. In medieval monasteries, monks and nuns were expected to pray, adhered to a strict daily routine centered on the canonical hours, which comprised matins, the day's first service, and when we say day, we mean the deepest hour of the night, when not even the owls had decided whether to ring the bell. a person who drew the short straw, and the entire dormitory of robed, sleep-deprived souls would frequently ring the toll, would quietly make their way to the chapel, still fully clothed, as monks didn't solely wear pajamas. They felt that the chapel's layering technique was spiritual, shimmering candlelight, and beneath the reverberation of stone vaults, they would recite scriptures, chant psalms, and attempt it was best to avoid dozing off while standing, which was a serious problem. Monks have been known to be disciplined for falling asleep during prayer, usually by having to perform more tasks or say more prayers. Fell asleep in mats? Congrats! You'll now be in charge of the following one. May go on for an hour or longer, but some very enthusiastic orders made it 2 hours. Can you picture trying to, as your stomach tells you that dinner was a bowl of lentils and a moral lecture, continue to be spiritually active? Following the ceremony, your body is aggressively closing down. Monks would either go back to sleep for their second sleep, or, under stricter guidelines, immediately transition to manual labor or study. Why was the idea so early? Nothing suggests religious discipline like threshing wheat after 4 hours of broken rest. Was to forego comfort in order to devote the first, quietest hour of the night to God, free from temptation. It was a potent emblem of devotion, or at least the warmth of sunshine or the REM cycles. At the very least, when you got past the candle smoke, numb feet, and Brother Ambrose's off-key chanting in the contemporary sleeping alone is frequently presented as a luxury, a symbol of freedom, tranquility, or just having control over the blanket, even though sleeping by yourself was frowned upon in the Middle Ages. Unfeasible, or simply dangerous. Let's start with the fundamentals. As we have shown, the warming beds weren't really cozy stone walls, and open people shared beds because central heating was still many plagues away, and chimneys didn't do much to trap heat. Body heat due to fundamental thermal desperation rather than intimacy. It was similar to a sleepover when kids stayed with their parents, siblings, and even the neighbor's child when they were over. However, there was a theological justification for sleeping in groups besides warmth, and no one asked if you wanted to be there. Many people thought that at night, the devil worked extra hard and alone, leaving your soul open to having other people around can lead to temptation, or even worse, possession. A sort of moral buffer zone where at least someone would see it or catch the demon if something went wrong. Initially, it was nearly impossible for kids to stay alone at night, not only for comfort, but because the nightly landscape stories cautioned against ghosts, fairies, and wandering souls. Unlike today's bedtime tales, a lone slumber can lead to mischief and spiritual danger. These stories ended with disappearances, even of married couples, rather than with embraces. Privacy wasn't a big deal because they frequently shared their beds with kids, servants, or uninvited visitors. In actuality, the notion of two individuals sleeping alone in a gigantic bed was a modern fantasy, so alien that it would have been regarded as useless or profoundly suspect in religious settings, even though monks frequently shared beds, and if yes, it was frequently for disciplinary reasons that someone was made to sleep alone. According to medieval reasoning, sometimes lying in bed by yourself was an actual penance. Public sleeping is made possible by solitary slumber. Responsibility. The next time you're lounging on your own bed with your own blanket in a goat-free room, savor the quiet. In the Middle Ages, you would most likely have 2 children, a sheepdog, and a relative. If you have ever unintentionally fallen asleep while sitting up in a lecture, a carriage, or you most likely woke up in the dentist's waiting room, feeling very sorry and with a crick in your neck. But in the Middle Ages, the practice of sleeping upright was not accidental. Several medieval people, especially the instead of sleeping flat, those who were wealthy or religiously pious, chose to sleep propped up. First, there was a medical theory that explained why none of the reasons were very restful. Believed sleeping flat was detrimental to the lungs, stomach, or overall equilibrium of the body humors. It made perfect sense in a world where doctors believed that a sneeze could change your soul. They felt that sleeping upright prevented brain congestion, which sounds scary, but just means don't. In addition to spiritual issues, lying flat was seen to be a sign of drowning in your own flesh. You didn't want to confound God, or worse, draw the notice of the angel of death by getting too near to the dead's pose. Death by sleeping in the same position as at funerals, which is utterly superstitious. However, you carefully chose your battles as a community health consultant, while your local priest also served as a result, individuals frequently slept with their heads propped up on wooden headboards or big bolster pillows. Nobility's beds were occasionally rigged with tilted supports to sustain a medieval equivalent of boy. Semi-seated position ideal for preventing unexpected demon attacks on monks or digesting one's nightly pork pie went one step further, and under more stringent guidelines, they might even fall asleep leaning against a wall or sitting erect on a seat. Chilly wall with only a hood to block the discomfort. This wasn't a health issue, it was regarding discipline. If you were too at ease, you might dream. And if you dreamed, you might commit a sin if you did it well. Welcome to confession at 5 in the morning. It goes without saying that this was about virtue rather than getting enough sleep. Discomfort and perhaps perplexing theology, forget goblins or haunting dreams under the true monsters of the night, were already under the sheets of the medieval people's beds. Little, persistent, and completely disregarding your prayers, we're discussing fleas, lice, and let's not mince words. The bedbug is the unofficial mascot of the medieval bedroom. Baths and laundry were uncommon in medieval Europe, and hygiene wasn't exactly at its best. Costly, and soap was occasionally manufactured with ingredients that were better kept unknown. Add shared beds, straw-filled mattresses, and the occasional live chicken beneath your feet, and you've got the ideal. Fleas and lice were so prevalent that they were essentially housemates in an all-you-can-eat insect buffet. Dealt with them on a daily basis, and although they had feather beds and silky sheets, some richer, dedicated nitpickers, or maids, were employed by homes to remove lice from their employers' hair and attire. Picture yourself as the royal master of your work title. In contrast, scalp bedbugs were the silent killers of medieval slumber, hiding in timber bed frames, mattress seams, and even stone wall fissures that appear at night to feed like microscopic. If you've ever wondered why medieval folks slept fully dressed and donned nightcaps, it wasn't always vampires. Occasionally, it was about warmth, and the armor solutions for insect defense ranged from somewhat in order to keep bugs away. Some homes used to burn fragrant plants like wormwood or tansy. Others slept with ashes or garlic onions in their beds, which may have kept the pests away, but at the very least, romance wasn't limited to bodily agony. Fleas were frequently regarded as emblems of immorality or evil. They serve as sharp reminders of the fall of whole poems were composed about fleas and the man's bad sleeping choices. Some moralizing, some strangely romantic people, because let's be is the best way to express love. While buzzing phones and streetlights disrupt modern slumber, we are joined like the flea that bites us both. Medieval sleep was more likely to be disrupted by twitching and scratching, as well as the faint sense that something was. We've all experienced sleepless nights, but we're crawling on your shin because it was. Have you ever attempted to fall asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? Apparently, nothing says sweet dreams like being ready to joust in the Middle Ages, so some people did just that. To be clear, not even knights slept in their beds on a regular basis. Trying to turn over in a suit of chains while wearing full armor was hot, heavy, and noisy. Mail is similar to attempting to take a nap inside a bag of silverware, but in times of conflict or in hostile, it was thought that resting in a partially armored area was a safer option. Highly advised for optional survival, a knight on campaign could eliminate just his keeping his masculine shirt or breastplate on. He wore his helmet and gauntlets in case his adversaries planned a nighttime raid. Nothing compares to waking up to the sound of hooves and having to get dressed while still half asleep for a surprise party. In castles under siege, dreaming about turnips, armed warriors may even sleep with swords or axes at their sides, similar to some extremely combative security blankets for bedtime that double as pillows and, at least the enemy wouldn't have to, get inside if they managed to breach the walls. Sleeping in armor wasn't exactly a priority, of course. Chainmail has a tendency to pinch skin, regenerative iron isn't breathable, and chilly stone flooring is minimal. You have a sleeping setting. That includes bedding, the background noise of snoring companions, and crackling torches. Scores somewhat lower on the comfort rating than the airport terminal, especially for people who are not in battle occasionally slept in hazardous areas while using minimal safety gear. Gamba's heavy quilting may be used for naps by on-duty, guards, or traveling merchants. Jackets that provided a little more cushioning and protection than the purely spiritual support of prayer. And lest we remember that armor wasn't particularly subtle, if you rolled over incorrectly, you could clank so loudly that, during a time when nocturnal events were common, everyone else woke up and thought the end of the world had come. Pigs in your bed and demon lice infestations weren't thought to be abnormal. One might assume that sleepwalking was just another medieval annoyance, but it was actually considerably more dramatic than that. People in the Middle Ages didn't blame strolling around while you were asleep. They thought you were possessed, bewitched, or had unresolved business with the Holy Roman Empire because of your worry or fatigue. In order to impress the local monk, empire sleepwalking or noctambulation was the notion that someone could get up from their straw pallet and shuffle across the room is not well understood and frequently feared. According to tales from the time, staring blankly at a wall was more devil's rehearsal feast than harmless parasomnia. Imply that sleepwalkers actually frightened people. Imagine a man holding a candle while wearing a long nightshirt. As he stepped over animals, his eyes went glassy, and he said something in Latin that you would assume was a ghost or heretic, or both. And an exorcism may be planned beforehand, based on your local priest. Breakfast. Some people thought that eating too much black food was the cause of sleepwalking. The medieval catch-all for whatever they couldn't explain, bile, was believed to have occurred because during sleep, the soul was momentarily freed, allowing the body to stumble around like an unsupervised mule. People tried everything from natural treatments to praying over their beds, with hanging irons, to stop these midnight travels. Charms, or simply tying a person's leg to a chair in more rural locations, if that it seems excessive given that there were open fireplaces, knives all around the place, and chamber pots waiting in some medieval homes. In one odd turn of events, it was fatally overturned, and there were reports of people scaling rooftops while they slept. Regardless of whether these reports were overblown, the fear of leaping dreamers resulted in window bans and sporadic theological discussions over the possibility of sin. Fortunately, most sleepwalkers only paced, mumbled, or tried to open their eyes while unconscious. Hypothetical doors. But if someone entered a church while dozing off, the locals could. If medieval existence taught us anything, we should interpret it as a divine message or a call for a cleansing ritual to cover all spiritual bases. Whatever it was, people wanted to know how to sleep through thunderstorms, church bells, and turmoil. The periodic siege for the sleep-deprived denizens of the area results in shrieking cattle. These were only background sounds during the Middle Ages, the equivalent of white noise. Let's begin with the sound of the church bells, which are marked for each religious daybreak, prayer, mealtimes, and of course, the ungodly hour of, if you lived next to a monastery, your fantasies would be realized at 2 or 3 in the morning, were most likely accompanied by regular tolling, and eventually the brain simply accepted it as the lullaby of a busy person. And it wasn't only bells that frequently experienced storms. Scary, experiencing every thunderclap like the world without the use of weather apps or triple-glazed windows. Roofs may leak, windows could creak, and chimneys could still wail like banshees. People slept because they had work to do, and neither ploughing nor insomnia stopped. Speaking of invasions and catastrophic events, praying or fleeing from Vikings. In the 14th century, events weren't necessarily a deal-breaker for bedtime either. Despite the food and fighting, many managed to sleep. Even the Black Death was viewed as more of a sobering wake-up call than a reason for fear when death carriages passed by in the morning. There are even documents showing that some people thought it was a blessing if you didn't wake up well. Of individuals sleeping through bonfires, earthquakes, and irate mobs, deprivation was widespread, and bodies adapted to working from dawn to dusk and eating just enough to stay alive. and were about to retire to sleep after spending the day avoiding mud taxes and spiritual damnation, when then there were people who used sleep as a means of escape, whether they were ill, grieving, or afraid. Some folks simply curled up under a cloak when it was predicted that the world would literally end every century, said a prayer, and dozed off. There's an odd wisdom in that. Throughout the winter of 1692, Salem, Massachusetts, was covered with more. There was more than just snow. There was tension, mistrust, and a subdued terror that crept into the frozen fields and timber-framed houses of Salem's Puritan residents, fervently religious and extremely superstitious. They thought they were constructing as sacred a city on a hill, a hamlet in the wilderness, and a city under God's watch, and Satan's stalk life was already difficult. The village had recently broken away from Salem town due to disagreements over religion and politics, and the harvests had failed. Nearby settlements had been devastated by smallpox, and conflicts with indigenous groups had scarred many. There was conflict amongst neighbours over inheritance and a strong dislike of anyone or anything beyond the neighbourhood, who didn't quite fit in, along with the harsh, long and dark new something had to shatter during England's winter, and it did so in the house of the town pastor, Reverend Samuel Parris, and his daughter Betty, age 9, and Abigail Williams, an 11-year-old niece, started acting oddly. They flung objects, shouted hysterically, and twisted their bodies in strange ways. Ways that they occasionally went hours without speaking, their eyes wide with. The girls reported that invisible forces were pinching and biting them, and their neighbours muttered that they were cursed. Unsure of what to do, Force's Reverend Parris summoned a local physician, William Griggs, gave the prognosis that would rock the community after failing to identify any physical cause. That one word ignited an inferno of chaos and witchcraft. The anxieties that were already present in Salem, where witches were thought to be actual, dangerous devil servants. The notion appeared plausible, and if the devil could infiltrate the minister's home, what did that signify for the community as a whole? The girls were prodded by both adults, and peers initially started identifying names, accusing women from socially marginalized groups, misfits and outsiders, but soon the wealthy and respectable will also be accused. Despite being a little community, the events that were about to transpire would have a significant impact. Beyond its boundaries, what started out as murmurs in the shadows would quickly turn into gallows yells and are the legacy that permeates American history books when the notion of witches took root in Salem and spread like ivy, initially quietly before choking everything, impacted Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and soon after, other girls like Mercy Lewis and Ann Putnam Jr. appeared to become more audacious every day. They yelled during prayers, seized in court, and said they could see evil spirits hovering above some villages. It was more than simply children's fantasy. It was a spectacular public performance. And most unsettlingly, it was thought that the women who already lived there and had the least protection were the first to be charged. Sarah Good was a destitute beggar who lived on the periphery of civilization. People accused her of grumbling to herself when she was turned away from doorsteps and she smoked a pipe, yelled at kids. She didn't fit the Puritan stereotype, thus she was more like a witch. Sarah Osborne, a woman who had not gone to church in more than a year, had embarrassed the community by getting married to. After her first husband passed away, she became an indentured servant, a lady who obviously bucked tradition. The enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's home, suspect Tituba, was the most her storytelling accent and folklore are the most exotic of all, having originated in Barbados. Put the villagers in danger and may have even physically beaten Tituba, confessed to witchcraft, but rather than putting an end to the controversy, she blew it wide open by sharing a tale about a tall man. A devil-related figure dressed in black requested her to sign a book that she claimed to have seen spectral dogs, crimson cats, yellow birds, and other unusual creatures. However, her most damning accusation was that the court only needed to hear once about other witches in Salem. Every week, new names were added as Tituba opened the door and others hurried through it. Old grievances were covered up as justifiable charges, and property disputes devolved into spectral attacks. Therefore, if a cow died unexpectedly, it had to be witchcraft. Surely the devil was responsible if a baby wept during prayer. The terror spread so widely that even the defenseless were afraid to speak up. To defend an accused person was to raise suspicions about yourself. Therefore, the best course of action was to remain silent. The village was caught in its sticky, invisible threads as the web of accusations grew. Hysteria had taken over as allegations increased, and the rationality was eroding. When the village neared a breaking point, the colonial administration intervened, and newly appointed Governor William Phipps created a special court to handle the chaos because they were eager to keep everything in order. Was known as the Court of Oya and Terminina, which means to hear and decide in French. But what it actually, the Salem Town Court served as a factory for fear-driven justice. It was not a typical tribunal in June 1692, and its regulations were distorted by panic. Rather than needing concrete proof or trustworthy witnesses, it permitted testimony was ghostly proof of something much more dangerous, that the victim had been plagued by the accused's ghost or spectre. In other words, never mind if someone said they saw your ghostly form choking them in a dream that was acceptable in court, that the accused's spirit could be found miles away or sleeping at church. You couldn't cross-examine a dream since you were performing the devil's work, and worse, couldn't refute it. Kids were now viewed as celebrities, and their screams, seizures, and by the time one girl, Mary Walcott, fell, the courtroom gasps had become more dramatic, broke out in tantrums as soon as a suspected witch entered the room. If a prisoner glanced at her, she screamed. If they didn't, the judges were enthralled with the performances, and she screamed louder. All defense attorneys were approved, including Chief Justice William Stoughton and prominent Judge Samuel Sewall. There were none. If you were accused during colonial proceedings, the idea didn't exist. The afflicted girls writhed in pain if you denied the accusations, and if you admitted, you might be escaped death. But the system only rewarded falsehoods if you named other people, penalized quiet, and even worse. The trials turned into public events that attracted people from all over, localities to observe them. The defendants were frequently led in shackles into court, confused, frequently impoverished, and nearly always helpless. But not everyone believed some. Residents in the community speculated that the girls were acting, while others asked why only particular kinds of people were being accused. But few publicly questioned the court, which implied doubting God's will in Salem. The law has become a mirror reflecting fear rather than reason. Justice's first victim, Bridget, was hanged on the Salem gallows on June 10, 1692. Bishop has a history of scandal and was a prime target due to her notoriety. Managed a tavern dressed in brilliant red, and had been charged with witchcraft years prior during her trial, according to her neighbors, said that their kids perished after she passed by, that her spirit snatched them in the night, and that she kept, even though she denied everything, the court discovered enchanted dolls. She was taken to Gallows Hill, a desolate, windswept area of land, solely because she was guilty. The rope was drawn, the audience watched, and there was no prayer or pity outside of Salem. The mechanism of death started to shake the hangings with just one execution. That swiftly followed on July 19th, when 5 further women were put to death. Sarah Wilds, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Susanna Martin all had positive. Rebecca Nurse in particular was a startling example of someone standing in a church. Even though the jury first acquitted the elderly devout woman who was well liked in the community, under pressure from Nurse's final words, the court and the affected girls reversed the verdict. Were spoken like a warning. I am as innocent as the unborn child, but the noose didn't matter. Did not practice discrimination in August, and further executions ensued. The bloodiest day was September 22nd, when 8 people were hung in one morning. Among them were Martha Corey, who had questioned the difficulties from the beginning, and her husband, Giles Corey, who had a different. Because Fate Giles declined to enter a plea, the court was unable to hold a trial. Without resorting to an antiquated English form of punishment, he was, over the course of 3 days, stones were heaped on his chest and pounded to death. According to folklore, his last remarks had more weight by the time the panic subsided. Numerous people confessed. 19 had been hung, 1 had been crushed to death, and at least 5 others had perished while incarcerated for trial. More than 200 people were falsely charged in order to save their lives, and the gallows cast long shadows over Salem. Fear had turned into law and justice, not only on the hill, but in everyone's heart as well. Blindfolded, they had been escorted to the gallows as hundreds of people sat in the spotlight for the executions. Claustrophobic, foul-smelling prisons awaiting a decision or a miracle that Salem's tiny jail was unable to. All alleged witches were imprisoned in nearby places like Ipswich and Boston, hungry and bound to walls. Forgotten and freezing, the majority of the accused weren't even witches. They were neighbors, friends, parents, kids, and misfits whose sole transgression was either arguing with the wrong person, or in many situations, harboring personal grievances over land that someone else desired. The claims that a pig went into a neighbor's yard and perished must be justified by divine justice. Someone who practiced witchcraft obviously cursed the axe when they refused to assist with firewood. One such instance was Mary East, the sister of the Rebecca nurse who was put to death. She was a revered mother of 7 who was first freed by the court and was well known for her religiosity. Days later, she was arrested again following fresh outbursts from the affected females. Her fate was sealed by her detention, and, in her final appeal to the judges, Mary pleaded with them not for her own life, but that they halt their actions before more innocent blood is spilled. Shortly after, she was hanged. Dorothy Good, Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter, was another noteworthy instance. Following her mother's incarceration, Dorothy was questioned and coerced into confessing to being a witch. Her responses, fear and nonsense, were misinterpreted as reality, and she spent 8 months in. When she was ultimately freed from the chains, she was mentally damaged and never fully recovered from the anguish that pregnant ladies did not experience. Elizabeth Proctor, whose spouse John Proctor would subsequently execute, was saved. Guilty and given a death sentence. However, because to her pregnancy, her execution was, she gave birth in prison and was later released. The delay probably saved her life. Accusations escalated after the trials concluded, with some of the accused confessing in desperate to save their lives. They accused others to divert attention from themselves, and whole families were dragged away. No one was out of reach when the dads, wives and daughters entered the spiral. While the food was scarce, disease spread, and some inmates perished while waiting in overcrowded jails. Trial lost in the paranoid legal limbo, and yet more names were added every week in Salem. It was more important to say what you wanted to say than who you were. By the fall of 1692, the excitement surrounding your name started to fade, not because the court regained its composure, but because reality pushed back. The pivotal moment occurred when people who had previously backed the trials found themselves abruptly on the defensive when charges became too strong. On the other side of them, former Salem clergyman Reverend George Burroughs was. He was imprisoned and accused of being the witches' ringleader. He was intelligent, articulate, and had previously fought with the village's powerful families, which was sufficient. However, Burroughs did something startling on the day of his execution. He stood on the gallows and performed the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, something that the public thought witches couldn't do. Became quiet, others sobbed, and even seasoned onlookers were disturbed, but the execution proceeded to sow a seed of doubt, followed by Mary's allegation. Governor William Phipps's wife, Phipps, abruptly became the target of the panic. Phipps, at the top of the colony's social scale, are already feeling uneasy due to mounting criticism. When anarchy ultimately broke out in October 1692, when he disbanded the Oyer court, and with Terminina stopping all pending trials and executions. Public opinion had changed. Once mute or complicit, ministers started speaking out more frequently. Mather is one of the most esteemed theologians in the colony condemned the use of spectral evidence, stating that tenet would be radical for a community to condemn one innocent person over alleged witches. That, for months, held the exact opposite view of those who had previously supported the jails were still full when the tribunals started to question them, but the desire for too many esteemed individuals were being charged, and more blood had dulled. After innocent individuals were buried, the townspeople realized that this was craziness rather than divine justice. Confessions stopped coming in. Some accusers turned back, while others vanished from plain sight, and those who had yelled the loudest before suddenly lowered their gazes. The terror remained, but it had run its course. The public wants stability. The authorities sought to preserve their reputation, and Salem was left feeling humiliated and damaged. The storm was ending, and it was finally ready to wake up from its nightmare. But the damage, when completed by the end of 1692, the legal structure that had supported with the dissolution of the court of Oye and Terminina in the year, hysteria started to crumble under the weight of its own ridiculousness. In October, the Superior Court of Judicature was established as a new, more cautious court. This time, in early 1693, things were different. The judges were much less receptive to the accuser's outrageous assertions, and spectral evidence was outlawed. The outcome was a sharp slowdown in convictions, with many alleged witches being most of the 56 cases that were presented before the new court were dismissed, including those that had previously acknowledged their fear and started to retract their statements. They had been compelled to fabricate the dramatic acts of the affected girls lost their ability to persuade others. The most notable instance in the trial's unraveling was that of the revered clergyman, Reverend Samuel Willard, was suspected of. He was never formally charged, yet the suspicion of such a prominent and pious guy demonstrated how capricious and corrupted the procedure. The court, which had before been fierce, was now wary. They started discreetly releasing those who were still detained first, followed by those with scant proof against them, and ultimately even those who had admitted to being a witch under duress, while the relatives of the executed started to seek justice and petitioned for the restitution of John Proctor's property. Rebecca Nurses, in order to remove her name from the community, her relatives started a campaign. Fear in the community caused church congregations to break up friendships. Governor Phipps realized that the colony's expanding worldwide influence had torn the fundamental foundation of Salem's social order. The remaining inmates were pardoned in 1693 out of humiliation, but even freedom came at a high price. Before being released, families had to cover their own jail costs. Can you picture losing your house, your health, and almost your life, just to be presented with a charge for the benefit of living until the end of 19 persons had been hung? 1 had been crushed to death, 5 had perished in prison, and the court didn't simply collapse it after more than 200 people were accused. Collapsed, leaving a hole of anguish, guilt, and incredulity where the trials had Salem was a community forever. But the healing process had not yet started, changed by the people, the mirror, the justice it had given up, and now that the gallows were silent, the jails had to be examined, had deserted. But Salem was anything but tranquil. The town wasn't plagued by ghosts, but rather by guilt that began with a few ill girls, had erupted into a widespread act of devastation, and families had been destroyed, innocent lives, destroyed, reputations, and now the survivors were forced to dwell in the wreckage, and neighbors were no longer able to look each other in the eye. Some of the affected girls discreetly departed town after they had testified against one another after praying together, disappeared from view, as others, including Anne Putnam Jr., would subsequently say in 1706 she publicly apologized in front of her congregation for her part in the trials, accusing Satan of illusion. But for many, the harm was Judge Samuel Swall was one of the court authorities who bore the burden beyond words. one of the most well-known individuals during the trials, was among the few to publicly acknowledge culpability. During a church ceremony in 1697, he stood in penance as a clergyman read aloud his, in an era when most people attempted to forget. Confession and prayer for forgiveness were an uncommon instance of accountability. It was difficult to forget, and the relatives of the condemned started to urge overtime. The Massachusetts government received a deluge of applications requesting formal pardons for returned property, for public recognition of the executed's innocence. The government gradually reacted in 1711, and the colony enacted legislation offering modest cash reparations and restoring the rights and reputations of some of the victims, their descendants. But even that wasn't all. Some families, such as the Proctors and Corey, were completely excluded, yet rumors of witchcraft persisted. Although it was New England, Salem's shame became ingrained in the towns in order to dissociate itself from its notorious former gallows. The village subsequently changed its name to Danvers. Since the village wished to bury not only the deceased, but also the memory of what had transpired, the hill was never formally designated. The recollection endured in stories and sermons during the quiet between former Salem was afflicted by fear, not witches according to friends, hubris and unbridled authority, and that scourge would persist for a long time after the Salem witch trials were put to an end almost 3 centuries ago, yet their influence endures, persists in reverberating, not only in historical tours and textbooks, but also in our concept of justice, dread, and the fragility of truth. The events of 1692 were more than just an odd mass incident. In the face of terror, hysteria was a breakdown of reason, empathy, and the rule of law. Ordinary citizens, farmers, midwives, and pastors turned into executioners just by too much faith and too little doubt in the courts that are supposed to safeguard the religious witness was turned into a weapon, and the defenseless were turned into instruments of injustice. Silence and drama turned into one of the most terrifying elements of Salem's tragedy is how rapidly it happened in just a few months. Overcome the reality that long-standing grievances, masquerading as spiritual warfare, were executed. It just required faith in them, not demons or devils. But the hardships also imparted valuable lessons that would be frequently mentioned, how the Salem incident affected American civilization in the years and centuries that followed. The US Constitution was drafted in. Discussions over civil freedoms and due process would specifically forbid things like ex post facto laws about a century later, as well as bills of attainder provisions that had effectively doomed the Salem accused, the assurance of the right to legal representation, the opportunity to confront your accusers, and the need for tangible principles that were partially created from the ashes of Gallows Hill provided tangible evidence. Nowadays, the term witch hunt has come to denote political persecution or moral panic, despite the fact that it's frequently spoken with little consideration for the actual horror that those phrases convey. In reality, Salem was not a metaphor, a hamlet where individuals were hung for fictitious offenses committed by. The most enduring lesson may be that the very mechanisms put in place to safeguard kids can turn into their own terror if left unchecked. Type of tyranny, and when courts use their authority to legitimize fear government's control over churches, makes it nearly impossible to stop. The Salem witch trials, such a warning story about how easily rationality can give way to terror, not just about one village's spiral into madness. Despite the gallows being removed and the courtrooms being silent, the warning truth is brittle, justice is not always served, and history has a way of repeated, unless we recall that Fulvia was born in 83 BCE, inside an old plebeian home owned by the wealthy yet somewhat eccentric Fulvi family that was not among the oldest, but it had long before pushed its way into the highest levels of Roman politics. The Fulvi patrician clans had produced generals, consuls, and orators. Fulvia's father Marcus was ambitious and had a penchant for upsetting things. Fulvius Bambalio's moniker literally means Bambalio, and he was more famous for his clumsy speaking than his political legacy. Mentioned his stammer, But Fulvia was born to command and wasn't a stammer. Fulvia would have been exposed to the harsh reality of Roman authority from an early age. In her home elections, senators and generals discussed policy, and she would have witnessed how betrayal was reported on a regular basis. Politics was not limited to the forum. It was also practiced by women in Upper Roman society at weddings, funerals, rumors, and backroom dealings. Households were supposed to be composed, well-educated, submissive, and quiet spouses. Fulvia knew she was wealthy, well-educated, and well-connected, and she would defy all of those expectations. Although nothing is known about her early years, her subsequent behavior points to a perceptive young woman. Politically aware and completely fearless, this person never faded. In the background, she possessed a powerful personality, a keen political intellect, and a desire to take action even in the male-dominated realm of Roman politics. This was also a time of the Republic was experiencing unparalleled turmoil as civil conflicts, and populist Rome was becoming a pressure cooker due to uprisings and power battles between generals like Caesar and Sulla Pompey. Instead of running away from the upheaval, Fulvia came of age in the midst of the old rules disintegrating, would come to utilize it. Her early years didn't yield the kind of lowly matron Rome envisioned, but rather a lady who guarded politics as a battleground to be conquered rather than a man's domain to be dreaded. She would go on to marry 3. Each of the strong men was a radical figure in Roman history, but Fulvia refused to simply get married. She would lead uprisings, command armies, and become the first Roman woman to appear on currency, not as a deity. But Rome wasn't prepared for Fulvia as she. Her first marriage, to Publius Caius Pulcher, was anything than ideal, but she was prepared for Rome. Conventional Caius was a popular agitator and not your typical Roman noble, with a penchant for upheaval, scandal, and street-level power. This political arsonist. He was a hero to the public, but to many of the Roman elite, he posed a threat. He was a strategic opportunity for Fulvia, and they married sometime in the early 1950s. Fulvia joined the man who had made the Roman Republic his own in BCE. Caius's personal theatre was notorious for his dramatic disregard for convention, once pretended to be a woman in order to sneak into a revered religious ceremony reserved for women at Caesar's house, which was scandalous. He later repented his actions, which only served to increase his popularity. Patrician rank to run for the position of tribunate of the plebs, which allowed him to veto the Senate. Fulvia was significantly less knowledgeable about Rome's street politics than Caius. She wasn't a silent partner, she was a passive consort standing next to him. According to Roman sources, Fulvia was involved in her husband's political life and actively participated in his supporters handled their home as a centre for Clay and were conspicuous during his campaigns. Together, they represented a new type of Roman power couple in politics. Fearless populists and unreservedly combative, but the partnership had a price in 52 BCE. Caius was killed on the route to Ion by his political adversary, Titus Annas Milo's bodyguards. His passing shocked everyone, waves through Rome, but Fulvia planned a political funeral because she wasn't going to grieve in silence. That historians still discuss today, she carried Caius's disfigured body into the bloody Roman Forum. Exposed for maximum impact, the people was appalled, and riots broke out. Fulvia had transformed private sorrow into public sadness, resulting in the Senate House being destroyed by fire. Her first significant political action was an uprising, and it was successful. Her capacity to control public opinion by using spectacle as a tactic and using her, she was a new type of participant. In Roman politics, because of her husband's legacy as a weapon, Caius was no longer there. But Fulvia didn't stay in grief after emerging from the shadows, and Rome would never see her the same way again. She knew better than anyone that political capital in Rome had a limited shelf life. Soon after the brutal death of Caius Pulcher, She married Gas Scribonius Curio, a rising on the surface. Curio appeared to be a political figure and one of Julius Caesar's most ardent allies. Match, he was known for his flamboyance and his penchant for drama. Yet underneath the in 50 BCE, Bravado was a shrewd political strategist who served as the tribune of the plebs. Curio had a great deal of power at one of Rome's most unstable times, when the Republic wavered between Caesar's aspirations and the Senate's opposition. There was both war and peace. This wasn't just a husband in Curio, it was a bridge to the next power block. Fulvia wanted a romantic comeback, but it was a planned alliance with Caius Gon, a new political figure who could continue the populist legacy established by her first husband, and who Fulvia remained after. Caesar's novelty fit both bills through him. Deeply ingrained in Rome's shifting power structures, she not only married into the movement, but also influenced it. Fulvia made certain that Caius's followers continued to be active, rebranding their cause under Curio's direction and maintaining the urban masses were politically active, but tensions were rapidly eroding in the Roman world. Curioso threw himself into the civil war that broke out between Caesar and Pompey. Battle on Caesar's side, Fulvia has consistently maintained her political involvement. Curio led a military campaign in 49 BCE and is said to have assisted in managing resources and organizing support for her husband's campaign. Attempt to secure Caesar's position in Africa, but it was a failure, and he was King Juba. The Numidia's troops ambushed and killed him. His death was horrible, destroyed once more, leaving Fulvia widowed, and Rome once more waited toe-check to see if she would disappear or if she didn't. Curio's death alone confirmed her position as a politically active widow with risky tenacity. She had now lost 2 spouses. Both had lost their lives defending populist ideas in Rome's civil strife. But Fulvia was not yet complete, and her most daring collaboration and dramatic chapter were yet to come. Fulvia's third, his most well-known union, was with Mark Antony, Julius's devoted comrade and aspirational general. Their union, which was formed in 47 BCE, was more than just a romantic one. Attachment, which involved a power merger, Fulvia had already established herself as Antony, a practitioner of Roman street politics, who rose quickly through the political and military levels, required that kind of astute assistance in Rome. They became one of the most influential political duos of the late Republic. Fulvia was accustomed to bloodshed and betrayal during their marriage, buried 2 husbands and outwitted many adversaries, so scandal was nothing new to Antony. He also drank, his personal life was usually turbulent, and he gambled. Yet with Fulvia, he'd discovered someone who could protect his interests and keep his ties together, in addition to providing him with entertainment. Despite his bravado, Antony was able to rally followers while he was out on campaign. Exterior recognized her worth and gave Fulvia the power to do what no. Before she got his letters, the Roman woman had openly wielded Roman sources, portrayed her as unfriendly, but she also sat in on meetings and influenced appointments while he was away. They saw her as domineering and power-hungry, but more than her desire, what bothered them was the way she behaved like after Caesar was assassinated in 44. A Roman man lived in a society without a vocabulary for such a lady. When the Republic was thrown into disorder again in BCE, Antony hurried to protect his role as Caesar's heir apparent, while Fulvia controlled Rome itself. And Antony established the second Fulvia served as his emissary in the capital, overseeing patronage networks alongside Octavian and Lepidus. In the order to keep Antony's fans active and coordinate with street gangs, she even assisted in setting up by marrying her daughter Claia to Octavian. Antony formally made amends with him. This partnership would later, whenever in public, Fulvia served as Antony's stand-in in addition to his wife. Roman coins with Antony's name and likeness were produced. Unparalleled recognition of her position. She stood in the full light of power rather than in its shadows. But Fulvia was going to push the boundaries of what a woman might achieve before Rome, a city where power was constantly borrowed, retaliated while Mark Antony sought political alliances and military campaigns. Fulvia was in charge of the streets of Rome throughout the Roman world, was not just his spouse, but also his regent, in all but name, during a time when Fulvia demonstrated that she could play the game just as well as, if not better than, any other player by using violence, bribery, and raw influence to maintain order. Following Caesar's murder, the Senate in Rome was a battleground devoid of swords, and authority had Fulvia recognized that she was a movable target and established Antony's power in the city by as his political stand-in. She led supporters, interacted with city dwellers, bargained with groups, and most boldly used words and money to wage war, funding devoted soldiers and offering bribes. Some ancient sources in particular to maintain public order and guarantee that any laws established benefited Anoni's future. Fulvia is portrayed as a cunning shrew by antagonists such as Ion and Dioasius, and even war-mongering, yet a woman is hidden beneath the sexist hyperbole, actively participating in politics in a society where women were only allowed to weave and grieve. Fulvia was forming alliances to support military leaders and even giving orders that are often reserved for. She also appeared in public and kept close ties with senators and consuls. Veteran soldiers were a crucial political group in the late, particularly during Antony's Eastern campaign. Fulvia frequently served as his spokesperson in Italy, meeting with centurions, reminding the soldiers of their allegiance to Antony, and influencing choices regarding the distribution of land came with benefits. But Roman aristocrats had to pay a price for their increased influence, especially the group that supported Antony's escalatingly hostile adversary and Octavian Caesar's heir. Their perception of Fulvia was that she was an intrusive woman who had too much power over laws and loyalty. Her independence from male supervision was not only dangerous, it also unprecedented. Fulvia wasn't gullible. She could tell that Antony and Octavian's animosity was rising. She recognized something that neither guy appeared to really understand yet, and their union was disintegrating. Wasn't large enough for both of them, so Fulvia started getting ready for the next stage, confrontation rather than diplomacy. After standing by power for too long, Fulvia decided to take matters into her own hands in 41 BCE. Inconceivable, she fought Octavian, the future Augustus, and she, with her husband Mark Antony still stationed in the East Fulvia, she didn't do it in silence. A consul and the younger brother of Lucius Antonius. Antony decided to contest Octavian's rule in Italy, which it was purportedly meant to protect, safeguard the land rights of Roman veterans who are devoted to Antony and his interests. Fulvia's fingerprints were found beneath everything, though, and this was more than simply politics. This was the first and only instance in Roman history where a woman led a military uprising, deliberately incite and plan a civil war, which is referred to as the Perusian Octavian's contentious land redistribution program, which forced many Italians to relocate, set off the war, reward his troops with Fulvia, which took advantage of the mounting dissatisfaction and portrayed Octavian as a despot and betrayer of Caesar's heritage. Lucius served as her spokesperson in behind the scenes. The Senate and Fulvia organized, raising 8 legions and captured the city of Peruia, which is now Peru. This was undoubtedly Fulvia's. According to historical accounts, she was more involved in the fight than Lucius was. She rallied soldiers and inflamed the Rome was ablaze with gossip about her, and she even corresponded with generals, directing legions, giving commands, and pressuring Lucius into conflicts he didn't want. Yet he was taken aback, took swift action, and, during the winter of 440 BCE, he attacked Peru, cutting off Fulvia, trapped between decreasing food and political betrayal, is being hammered into submission by supplies. Observed her audacious gamble fail, and the city gave up Lucius in early 40,000 BCE. Perhaps in an effort to keep Antony from becoming enraged, Antonius was spared, but Fulvia was banished, and the lady who had previously led armies, riots, weddings, and public opinion was now thought to. She was exiled to Sicyon in Greece because she was deemed hazardous for Roman territory. But Antony didn't. As time went on, the once strong bond between a husband and wife had weakened due to the haze of conflict and distance, performed in his name. Yet it's possible that she did something without his consent. The Republic now made the Roman woman who had previously waged a civil war pay for it. Fulvia, who was exiled from Rome, ended up at Sicyon, a Greek city that had turned into a sort of diplomatic hellhole for failed power brokers. She had fought the war for no personal benefit. However, she thought she was protecting Mark Anoni's interest in her husband's name, his honor, and possibly their similar perspectives on Rome. But what she would find in Fulvia had risked everything for silence. And exile wasn't a welcome place for heroes. Rank, her relationships, and her life. But Antony did not rush to meet. Actually, Fulvia was already entangled with Antony when she got to Greece. Whether their love affair had started when Cleopatra was in Egypt, the symbolism was. The treachery occurred when Antony was raising goblets at a dinner next to a queen, while Fulvia was raising armies, cut deeply, both politically and personally. Fulvia had waged a war to defend Antony's authority in Italy, and he allowed her to. According to Plutarch and other ancient historians, Antony was enraged. Others disagree with her for starting the Persian War without his express consent. He welcomed her demise since it made room for Octavian and Fulvia to form a marriage arrangement. Fulvia was never accepted, but she did have some admirers, including some of Antony's. Reconciliation was pushed by her fervently devoted troops, but her health had started to fail following her banishment and betrayal during the siege. Fulvia passed away at Sicyon in 40 BCE. She died at the age of 43, probably from disease, stress, heartbreak, or all three. Gave Antony a smooth political escape. He later met Octavian and consented to marry Octavian's sister Octavia. The Trivers were momentarily reunited as part of a restored peace accord. But only because Fulvia, the one woman who dared to question their intentions, was no longer there. The reputation of Fulvia will soon be eclipsed by that of Cleopatra, whose legends almost all Roman women of the time shared. However, it should be noted that Fulvia was the prototype and did not have any authority over. She marched into it from behind a curtain, stood in the middle, and daring to lead armies in a society that viewed women as furniture eliminated her. But just the ashes remained because Rome didn't know what to do with her. After Fulvia's death in 40 BCE, rumors of her insurrection would persist, and her story was anything but typical. Antony Octavian, one of the guys she had previously manipulated, and even her former. Since she was unable to defend herself, allies started the silent task of rewriting her legacy. Her adversaries and the uneasy survivors of her ambition influenced the story, and Fulvia became a scapegoat, just like so many other strong women throughout history. She was depicted in ancient records, primarily written by men with vested interests, as the conflict between Antony and Octavian, as well as even the general chaos in the Republic during the time of Dionysius, and Plutarch portray her as domineering, envious, and motivated by a desire for power, and they held her accountable for dragging, for upsetting Octavian, and even for Antony's eventual alienation from Rome. Lucius Antonius got into a fight. However, were these charges justified? Fulvia had hardly been involved in a political environment where, at least for men, deception and violence were expected. She was far less pushy than Pompey, no more ambitious than Caesar, and brutal than Octavian would ultimately turn out to be. The only real difference was that she was a woman posing as a Roman. Rome, and the man couldn't comprehend that she wasn't confined to the house. She was writing letters to generals, arranging street weaving, or acting as a political adornment. Mobs, and commanding troops' allegiance, which made her dangerous not just to Octavian, but even Mark Antony, the man whose legacy she left behind, is remembered by history, fought for convenience, and, after making amends with Octavian, accused Fulvia of causing the civil unrest. And, getting married to his sister, Antony utilized Fulvia's passing as a diplomatic purification. No memorials were erected in her honor, and her memory became the cost of his political survival. Her detractors were unable to remove the hush that followed, her funeral and the Senate's mourning statements. Her entire Fulvia had gone too far. She had led elections and gathered armies, waged a civil war, formed alliances, and was the first Roman woman whose name first appeared on coinage as a political agent rather than as a deity or metaphor. Her reputation was intentionally damaged, but despite all efforts, she was still recorded in history. Fulvia refused to disappear, and her defiance still reverberates despite being buried behind lies and caricature. You just must. The men's account of Fulvia ends in quiet, but her in the centuries that followed her passing, historians and authors found it difficult to put her in the big narrative of Rome because Fulvia defied all expectations of what a Roman lady should be. She became power rather than merely advising power from the shadows, which made her profoundly and enduringly memorable. Disturbing to live in a patriarchal environment where women were supposed to influence via marriage and whisper. Fulvia yelled through political drama and policy conflict that she was not a consort. Despite being a commander, she was more known for her disobedience than. Roman historians were unable to accept a woman who left her position, so they recast her as disruptive and loud, power-hungry, but able to read between the lines, and a Fulvia, the first Roman woman to produce coins bearing her name, emerges as a distinct figure. Roman street politics were influenced by organized political groups who used marriage as a tactical tool. With amazing efficiency, she navigated the civil conflicts of the 1st century BCE without not a spectator, but as a participant, a woman whose power frightened lawmakers and influenced Triumpha's destiny. Her demise wasn't brought about by incapacity, but rather by timing and gender. She would have been regarded as a more endearing Cato or a second Caesar if she had been born a man. Instead, she was, despite being portrayed as the evil woman who dared too much, her legacy persisted in silence. Later Roman ladies such as Cleopatra, Agrena the Younger, and Livia Drusilla, she imagined that everyone would function in the shadow, that Fulvia had helped create, manipulating. Although emperors command armies and manage succession, Fulvia was the first to, without an imperial title to protect her. Contemporary historians have started. Reviewing Fulvia with new eyes is no longer a warning story. Instead, she is being acknowledged as one of Roman history's most politically engaged women. Someone who challenged she didn't only live in the era of triumvirs, she pushed the limits of female power and paid the price. Fulvia left fingerprints in every crevice of its collapse, despite Rome's attempts to obliterate them. A woman who was centuries ahead of her time. The United States was on the brink of two worlds by the summer of 1963, one with centuries-old roots. In the Deep South, oppressive systems and another yearning for freedom, Black Americans were prohibited by law, and segregation was more than simply a social convention. From eateries, educational institutions, vehicles, polling places, and even drinking fountains, there was widespread police violence. Lynchings continued to happen, especially in locations like snarling dogs and high-pressure fire hoses, were being used against peaceful protesters in Birmingham, Alabama. But things were about to change. Coming, and it wasn't requesting authorization. The civil rights movement had exploded into the boycotts, and freedom rides have become commonplace in the national limelight. Leaders in the news like John Lewis, Rosa Parks, and Medgar Evers were more than simply names. Although the March on Washington was a show of resistance, it wasn't the result of one exchange, was the outcome of growing annoyance and intense hope for Black. Americans were demanding civil rights because they could no longer wait, and they were resolved to speak up in the nation's capital, where it counted most. For decades, Philip Randolph, a labor activist, has been advocating for a large-scale march in Washington, D.C. The idea was first put up by the organizer and seasoned civil rights activist in the 1940s. It was intended to exert pressure on the Roosevelt administration to integrate the defense sector. Roosevelt gave in and signed an executive order ending the protest, although the stakes were even higher in 1963, when Randolph and other civil rights Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Bayard Rustin were among the leaders who brought the idea back to life. They weren't just demonstrating for work this time. They were also marching for school, voting rights, and dignity, desegregation for fair compensation, and, above all, for the fundamental human right to life without fear. More than a dozen significant civil rights organizations joined forces to organize it in spite of their numerous disputes because they recognized the strength of a united front. The countdown had already started, and buses were being. Word of mouth was spreading more quickly than newspapers because to planned posters. And Black Americans nationwide were getting ready for what would turn out to be one of the most significant events of one step at a time. The dream of American history was being realized. Organizing a protest in Washington, D.C. was no easy task, but organizing one for more than 100,000 people, possibly more, were insane from a logistics standpoint. Terrifying. Food, drink, transportation, sound systems, restrooms, and medical personnel permits, safety plans for crowd control, but they managed to make it happen. At the heart of this managed mayhem was Bayard Rustin, a man who, in spite of Rustin, was a brilliant tactician who was openly gay and frequently kept out of the spotlight for political reasons. He had marched, been imprisoned, beaten, and learned nonviolence under Mahatma Gandhi's followers in India, concealed by the FBI. But he was unfazed and saw the March on Washington as an opportunity to demonstrate what a military-coordinated, disciplined, peaceful protest could accomplish: accuracy. Rustin and his group turned the concept into a reality in just 8 weeks. In actuality, the march was purposefully billed as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, to incorporate the dual message of economic opportunity and racial justice, which was not accident. But Randolph and Rustin were the ones who ensured that Dr. King would subsequently become the day's spiritual icon. The demands were as much about workers' rights and the minimum wage as they were about civil rights. Meanwhile, there were simmering tensions between President John F. Kennedy and the administration was extremely anxious because they were afraid of riots, retribution, or, fearing violence, civil rights leaders promised that the demonstration would be non-violent. Hospitals in Washington, D.C. were placed on notice, while the National Guard remained on standby. Federal employees were even advised they may remain at home, and the sale of alcoholic beverages was prohibited for the day. The Big Six civil rights organizations Unity, NAACP, CPS, SNCC, SCC, Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and the National Urban League frequently disagreed over tactics. Some sought more. SNCC's juvenile firebrands were more diplomatic than radical, becoming irritated with King's non-violent strategy. But they all concurred that after the allotted time for silence, Rustin's plan appeared to be a military operation. Every speaker was timed to the minute, every bus and rail was monitored, and every route had crowd-control trained marshals who were not just organizing a march, but also a moment. August 28th, something that would shake a nation's conscience. On a hot Wednesday in 1963, the sun was already hot at 9 a.m. in Washington, D.C. Despite the humidity sticking to their skin like a second garment, they continued to travel across the nation. Came celebrities, black-white young people, clerics, and factory workers. While some clutched protest posters and arrived by bus, others donned their Sunday best. More than 250,000 people are gathered on the train, carpooling, and even walking on. Despite the turmoil, the National Mall was like a surging sea of hope. Because of the government's concern of rioting and disturbances, the situation was remarkably peaceful, with volunteers directing foot traffic in the Redwater groups applauded, held hands, sung songs of freedom, and distributed crosses. As more marchers gathered, you could hear cries of freedom and employment resonating from gospel choirs by the reflecting pool. Off the Lincoln Memorial's marble columns, celebrities joined in as well. Sydney poet Paul Newman, Belfonte, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, and Bob Dylan. But no, they were there to see history, get signatures, and raise their voices for a cause greater than themselves. The crowd was lively but well behaved. There was no pushing, there was no violence or theft, only a mutual awareness that this wasn't only a protest. Many Black Americans saw it as a sacred event. It was revolutionary to stand on the mall and be recognized, to be able to declare, "We are here in front of." It was a full-circle event, with generations in the past sitting in stone before the same Lincoln Memorial, where the great emancipator leaders entered the stage as the official program started at precisely noon. By one each, symbolizing many locations and groups' philosophies, although speakers united in their message called for equal wages, desegregated schools, and a livable wage. Mahalia Jackson sang "Marion" and called for a salary and an end to police abuse. Due to her race, Anderson was previously prohibited from performing at Constitution Hall. Today, she performed for thousands of people below. As the hours went by, the anxiety increased in the open sky. The man everyone was waiting for had not yet spoken. And when, not out of discontent, but out of anticipation, when he did, everyone would pause, pay attention, and realize that the march wasn't about creating minute by minute. History was turning into mythology, and by mid-afternoon, the audience had become silent, not because they were worn out, but because they were aware of what was about to happen. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., standing beneath the Lincoln Memorial's shadow, walked up to the podium wearing a dark suit, a well-tied tie, and a look of profound serenity that hardly covered off the. He carried prepared words that were typed and composed as the fire inside him grew, cooperatively with his advisors the previous evening. But the text that was typed was not what the world would remember, was what he started with controlled intensity, straight from his heart, describing the terrible truths of police brutality, discrimination, and unfulfilled promises a century later. He said, his voice rose and fell like a bell, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, "The Negro is still not free." Discourse, he employed quiet, rhythm, and repetition not as fillers, but as. The audience listened intently to the instruments, with some nodding and others. Others were holding posters that just read "Now," while others were wiping away their tears. But what occurred next, which altered the event's overall tone and maybe the course of the civil rights movement? Gospel icon Mahalia Jackson, who had performed earlier that day, was standing directly behind King when she broke down in tears. Martin said, "Tell them about the dream," and King did just that. He put down his notes, grabbed the podium, and began a piece that he had before given, but never in this manner. The audience leaned in as he said, "I have a dream that one day, this country will rise up and embody its creed," with each word becoming more and more obvious, more determined. "I imagine that someday the sons of former slaves and the sons of former, in my fantasy, slave owners will be able to gather at the table of brotherhood. My four little one day, children will live in a country where their content will be evaluated rather than their skin color. Of their character, it was no longer a speech, but rather a lightning bolt, a vision, or a prayer." History, by the time King concluded, saying, "Free at last, free it. Thank God Almighty, we are finally free." The audience burst into cheers and tears. Shouts of delight were heard as they realized they had just seen something beyond oratory. They had heard the might of the March on Washington was about the people and the enormity of humanity, not simply about the speeches and the music. They traveled from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, and California, and the crowd that day was tremendous. Some were seasoned campaigners who had participated in a dozen previous marches, while others had never left their hometowns, packed sandwiches, rested, and traveled by bus for more than 20 hours. Many were regular individuals, maids, teachers, and others, simply to be there in their church attire. Postal clerks and steel workers who considered themselves witnesses rather than political figures, and didn't only wish. There were young black children in the audience as well, and they were the change. Boys, with hand-drawn signs, and girls with ribbons in their hair were lifted by their parents, toddlers onto their shoulders so they could hear the speaker voices and see the Lincoln Memorial in the distance, loudspeakers to them. This wasn't only a gathering, it was the start of something new. A young John Lewis, only 23 years old, was one of the faces that stood out in the globe. His initial remarks, made on behalf of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, had been such minutes before he took the stage. Senior executives advised him to calm down since he was so unyielding and fiery. Agreed, but the crowd was nonetheless shaken by his desire for drastic change. Then came Daisy Bates, who was the lone female speaker that day, but the organisers had come under fire after giving a prepared message on behalf of other civil rights women. Bates's succinct yet impactful message highlighted a terrible reality, even as it marginalised female voices. Some voices in an equality movement, nevertheless, had difficulty being heard. Organisers of the union, rabbis, nuns, priests, and students of all backgrounds disagreed on tactics, with some favouring King's the absence of violence. Others supported Malcolm X's more aggressive stance. But for that one day, unity triumphed over those diversity, creating a visual symphony. Of American potential, black and white hands united in support of freedom. Now chest-mounted buttons and the sound of 250,000 people breathing all at once as one. Though the faces in the audience were influencing history rather than merely witnessing it. They would all never forget what they witnessed when the world came together. Behind the scenes, the March on Washington was a time of poetic justice and inspiration on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. What appeared to be a perfectly timed maneuver was actually everything but easy. Along with a great deal of last-minute compromise and perspiration, Bayard Rustin, the chief. The march's architect had to contend with politics in addition to logistics, continually being watched, not only because he was a former communist and openly gay, but also because several civil rights leaders feared that Congressman Adam Clayton Powell's identifier would be used to disparage the cause, had previously claimed that if King didn't remove Rustin from an event, he would publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of being lovers. The threat that plagued every planning stage of the previous campaign was followed by the problem of women's voices, in spite of the important roles that women like Ella Baker have performed. Dorothy Height and Diane Nash were asked to give important remarks on their own, and Rosa Parks was present and admired by everyone. Yet she was not given the microphone. The movement's truth was hidden under the march's striking visuals, even inside the Big Six. It continued to grapple with its own blind spots and hierarchies. Leaders of the friction-bubbled SNC were becoming more and more frustrated with the slow. The elder generation's insistence on moderation and the speed of change meant that they sought to address systematic racism. Similar frustrations were felt more forcefully by CORE, but unity was thought to be too significant for a single day, as the federal government tightened its teeth and watched. Jay's teeth. More than 100 spies were tasked by Edgar Hoover's FBI to spy on. The organizers tracked important people, bugged hotel rooms, and gathered dossers. When nothing of the sort happened, they were certain that the march would degenerate into violence, or that communists would take over. Occurred, they merely increased their monitoring, particularly of Dr. King, and let's not overlook the financial burden of the march. The majority of the $250,000, which is now worth millions, was raised through unions and organizers, and benevolent donors rushed until the last minute, even borrowing walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. Although the March on Washington was monumental, it was also incredibly flawed and human, chaotic, political, and incomplete, just like the nation it aimed to heal. As the masses gradually moved away, the sun started to set behind the Washington Monument. People who were scattered, hugged, sobbed, sung, and stayed as long as they could grudgingly, to depart from what seemed to be holy territory. But the march was over. The world had watched. Speeches had been given. Placards had been put up. And now the question hung heavily. What transpires in the days that follow in the muggy August air? The response from the media was cautiously favourable, although prominent media recognised the event's historic significance, frequently with an air of disinterested curiosity. Some referred to it as dignified and orderly. It meant that nobody rioted, and that a few stores gave plenty of room to the march's particular goals, such as the desire for a federal jobs program or a minimum wage of at least. Although it cost $20 today, everyone saw Dr. King's address, which at least could not be disregarded. President John F. Kennedy, who had originally objected to the march's concept, watched it happen on TV with increasing respect and maybe surprise. He met with civil rights activists at the event and described it as impressive. White House right away, but his planned civil rights legislation didn't proceed quickly enough. The act was still blocked in Congress, and some activists were trapped in the Southern Opposition Clause. They were disappointed because they had hoped that the march would lead to immediate action. It was time to get back to work, planning marches, opposing, and grieving those. Who was the one who had to pay for justice? Only a few weeks later, reality set in. 4 black females were murdered at the 16th Street on September 15, 1963. Yes, the dream had been expressed regarding the Birmingham Baptist Church bombing, but the March on Washington had altered. But the nightmare was not finished yet. Represented a turning point in the civil rights movement by demonstrating that large-scale demonstrations could be controlled, effective, and it was unavoidable, and united a larger coalition than ever before. Students, working-class Americans, labor unions, religious leaders, and celebrities, all in a single location, bound by justice. And above all, it provided the motion. A dream, a voice, or a speech that would be recited, examined, and repeated. The global march was over, but the journey was only getting started. And that soon, the road would lead through blood law and change. Not only did the March on Washington, America's conscience was shaken and its moral landscape was altered. What had started as a bold act of protest, it became a pillar of the civil rights movement's heritage, forever changing. How Americans viewed the march in terms of legislation, justice, democracy, and the strength of group action didn't result in wins right away, but it generated momentum in July, less than a year later. 64. The Civil Rights Act was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, prohibited discrimination in the workplace on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, followed by the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which was startling at the very. Would these bills have passed without the march? They are at the core of Jim Crow laws. However, would they have possessed the same moral strength and unquestionable public pressure for Martin Luther? King Jr.'s speech that day sent him into a new sphere. He went from being a well-respected leader to a worldwide celebrity, included warnings of expense surveillance and, eventually, the 1968 assassination. With every year that went by, the dream he described on those stairs would grow more tragic, profound, and revered. For the larger movement, the march provided organizers with a template and demonstrated what unity might accomplish for widespread mobilization, and it served as an inspiration to a generation of activists, student demonstrators in Europe, anti-apartheid activists in South Africa, and the March on Washington would serve as a model for future human rights activists worldwide. But the legacy isn't merely historical. The concept of freedom and employment was the march's language, the picture of nonviolent opposition. I Have a Dream's echoes continue to reverberate throughout contemporary Black lives. Matter marches and protests like the Million Man March echo. Every chant and cardboard sign in Washington, D.C. echoes the year, 1963. Visitors pass King's imposing memorial, which is currently located just across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial. Words from that August day inscribed into the rock, along with a likeness carved in stone. The actual memorial, however, is not in stone. Rather, it is found in classrooms, voting booths, and marches, and voices that wouldn't stop speaking, because the dream wasn't supposed to be preserved in history books, but rather lives, and that July afternoon's legacy continues to challenge us to do so. That July afternoon, when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the sun, was more than 60 years ago. The Lincoln Memorial's shadow, documentaries and textbooks have memorialized the March on Washington, and displays in museums, schools teach Dr. King's eloquence and his steady voice and powerful resonances in the collective memory of the country, akin to a holy refrain. Yet for many, the questions tase: has the dream come true, or has it just been postponed in some manner? There is no denying progress. The segregationist legal system was abolished. Voting rights were gained through blood marches and legal cases, but they are currently being attacked again in several places. Opposes the existence of black judges, mayors, lawmakers, and even a two-term US in 1963. The president was unimaginable. Once prohibited, interracial marriage. These are not minor issues that are now protected by federal law in many parts of the nation. Things that are triumphs forged by unrelenting effort. But the initial King's address frequently eclipsed the march's demands, which are still heard today. Racial gaps in schooling remain unsolved, and the demand for a livable wage remains unfulfilled. Housing, work, and healthcare are still deeply ingrained, and police violence is the same idea that spurred a lot of the early civil rights activism now elicits anger and protests. The hope of true economic fairness in a nation where opportunities are not based on skin color or zip code is still a long way off. Fact. Contemporary movements such as Black Lives Matter have embraced the cause. Frequently employing the rhetoric and imagery of the 1963 march is both a source of inspiration and a critique of the same. Cities seek the same fundamental human rights and chant in the same streets. However, they operate in a world that has been altered by social media monitoring and novel of opposition. The March on Washington was intended to be a flashpoint and a stake, not the end. "This is who we are, and this is what we demand," was written in the Earth Dot statement rather than a resolution. Thus, the dream continues to be beaten and questioned. Whether it is delayed or warped, it is still alive, but reinterpreted. Maybe one day, realized depends on our decisions rather than the past. The injustices we face, the bravery we muster to march. Once more, and once more until the dream is realized as a common reality.